What you are about to read is not speculation, it is not a theory, it is a documented, verified, and deeply uncomfortable truth that the American defense establishment has spent the last several weeks trying to bury beneath layers of press conferences and corporate stock price optimism. And if you care about where this country stands militarily, strategically, and economically in the next decade, then this conversation is one you cannot afford to miss. Because while Washington was busy telling you that Iran's military was collapsing, that the defense systems were working as designed, and that America's industrial war machine was operating at full strength, the real picture emerging from the battlefield was telling an entirely different story. And that story begins with a number that should make every single American stop cold. 40,000 shells, a wall of fire that didn't care how much money the Pentagon had spent on systems designed to stop it. Let's start at the beginning because you have to understand the context before the gravity of this moment truly settles in. In late February 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran. The opening strikes were loud, expensive, and spectacular by any measure. More than 500 Tomahawk cruise missiles built at Raytheon's Tucson plant were fired into Iran in the first 16 days of the war alone. Weapons worth roughly $1.9 billion by independent estimates, with analysts noting that replacing that stockpile could take at least 5 years. The American war machine was burning through ammunition at a rate that should have alarmed every taxpayer and every strategic planner in Washington. But the headlines were celebratory, the talking heads were triumphant, and the deeper, more dangerous story was quietly accumulating in the background. Because while American Tomahawks were hitting Iranian targets in the opening phase, Iran was doing something far less glamorous and far more strategically calculated. It was deploying a mixture of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and an almost industrial-scale production of cheap, slow, maddening drones, Shaheds, Arash variants, loitering munitions that cost a fraction of the interceptors required to destroy them. During Operation Epic Fury in late February 2026, Iran launched a massive opening barrage of 170 missiles on the very first day, before the intensity of attacks plummeted. But by that point, the damage to American defensive posture was already being calculated. And Iran's goal was never simply to win each individual engagement. Iran's goal was to drain the magazine, to turn the cost asymmetry into a strategic weapon, to force the most expensive military on earth to burn through its most precious assets, fighting off swarms of machines that cost a few $1,000s each. Now here is where we need to talk about Raytheon, because this is not a story that fits neatly into the cheerful investor presentations or the shareholder calls that followed the outbreak of hostilities. RTX Corporation, Raytheon's parent company, saw its stock surge in the opening days of the conflict, and the company is now facing demands from the Pentagon to dramatically scale up production of multiple critical systems. But here is the question that the financial press is not asking loudly enough. How did we get here? How did the most expensive, most celebrated, most marketed defense architecture in human history end up so exposed so quickly to a country that has been under heavy sanctions for 4 decades? The answer is not comfortable, but it is honest. And it lives inside the performance failures of 3 specific systems that were supposed to hold the line. The first of those systems is THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. For years, THAAD has been sold to the American public and to America's allies as the crown jewel of ballistic missile defense, an interceptor that kills threats outside the atmosphere, a system so sophisticated, so precise that it effectively neutralizes the ballistic missile threat entirely. In March 2026, a THAAD radar system was struck and apparently destroyed at Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan in the early days of the war. Read that again. A radar that is fundamental to the entire THAAD engagement architecture, gone, struck, destroyed, and when you lose the radar, you effectively blind the system. The THAAD battery at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia was operating at reduced effectiveness because its AN/TPY-2 radar had been damaged in an earlier Iranian strike, and THAAD is optimized for high-altitude threats but does not engage drones, meaning that once its primary sensor was compromised, the complete burden fell on Patriot interceptors. This is what a cascading failure looks like in a real war, not a neat, clean theoretical scenario, a real-life cascade where one hit on the radar unravels an entire defensive architecture worth billions of dollars, and the numbers behind this collapse are staggering. The United States fired approximately 150 THAAD interceptors in support of Israel during the earlier 12-day war with Iran in June 2025, representing about a quarter of all U.S. THAAD interceptors funded to date, and each Lockheed Martin interceptor costs roughly $15 million. Those were supposed to be emergency reserves. Now, by the time Operation Epic Fury was well underway, the picture had deteriorated further. Over the 7 weeks of war, the US military expended at least half of its inventory of THAAD missiles and nearly 50% of its stockpile of Patriot air defense interceptors, according to analysis by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Half the THAAD stockpile, nearly half the Patriots. In one conflict, against a country that the Pentagon had spent 2 decades classifying as a regional power, not a peer competitor. The second system to examine is the Patriot, specifically the Patriot PAC-3, Raytheon's flagship ground-based air and missile defense interceptor. The Patriot has been the backbone of American forward base protection across the Middle East for decades. David Shank, former commandant of the Army's Air Defense Artillery School, noted that American Patriot battalions have been rotating in and out of Qatar, Bahrain, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia going back to the mid to late 2000s. And the war planning always factored in the finite number of interceptors available, with certain positions expected to go Winchester, meaning completely out of ammunition, by a specific day in any major conflict. That is a military planner speaking from direct operational experience. He is telling you that the people running these systems have always known the magazines are finite. They've always known that in a sustained engagement you run out. What apparently was not wargamed with sufficient rigor was the Iran scenario. A prolonged saturation-style campaign using cheap drones to drain expensive interceptors, followed by precision ballistic strikes exploiting the degraded defensive network. On March 27, 2026, Iran executed a combined strike on Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, a facility defended by both THAAD and Patriot systems, using approximately 6 ballistic missiles, combined with dozens of Shahed kamikaze drones in a perfectly timed attack that came after weeks of preparatory strikes that had degraded American and Saudi radars across the Gulf. The base was hit, aircraft were destroyed, American troops were wounded, and the defense systems that were supposed to prevent that outcome failed, not because the technology is worthless, but because the strategy Iran employed was specifically engineered to find the seams in layered defense architecture and pull them apart. NBC News reported that Iranian attacks damaged warehouses, aircraft hangars, command headquarters, satellite communications infrastructure, runways, advanced radar systems, and dozens of aircraft across multiple American facilities, with total repair costs expected to run into the billions of dollars. This is not a footnote. This is the actual record of how these systems performed under the pressure of a real campaign. The third system is one that most Americans have never heard of, but it sits at the heart of the drone problem that has turned this entire conflict into a grinding, expensive war of attrition. The CRAM, Counter-Rocket Artillery and Mortar, is a land-based version of the Navy's Phalanx close-in weapon system. It uses a radar-guided Gatling gun to destroy incoming rockets, mortars, and increasingly drones. And here is the problem with CRAM that no one at the Pentagon press briefing is going to tell you directly. CRAM was never built for this fight. It was built to swat mortar rounds in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it is pretty good at that. What it was never designed to be is the primary line of defense against low-flying, wave-after-wave, dirt-cheap Iranian kamikaze drones. And yet that is exactly what it has become by default, because there is nothing else in the American inventory that fills the gap between a $15 million THAAD interceptor and the physical threat posed by a $20,000 Shahed drone flying low and slow into a base compound. On March 14, 2026, a coordinated drone strike penetrated the heavily fortified Green Zone and directly hit the United States Embassy compound in Baghdad, with reports indicating the strike bypassed layered security measures without triggering defensive fire, and that a satellite communication system used for secure diplomatic data transmission was destroyed in the attack. A drone hit the embassy in Baghdad, inside the Green Zone, with CRAM on site. And the way Iran-aligned media celebrated the destruction of that CRAM system tells you everything you need to know about the psychological and strategic objective of the attack. It was not simply about the damage, it was about the message that the system designed to protect American personnel and infrastructure in one of the world's most heavily defended diplomatic compounds could be neutralized. The Giraffe radar destroyed at the Baghdad embassy was part of the CRAM sensor network, and its loss delivered a meaningful blow to early warning capability. While CRAM's organic gun radar remains operational, the broader sensor layer that enables timely detection in mass drone events was degraded. Now let's zoom out from the individual system failures, because the full picture is more alarming than any single incident. What we are looking at is a structural exposure that predates this war and has been dramatically accelerated by it. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, restoring depleted stockpiles and achieving desired inventory levels will take many years, with the munitions risk accepted by President Trump as a trade-off for winning the current conflict rather than preserving capability for a future war with China that may never happen. That is a policy choice, and it is a choice with consequences that extend far beyond the Iran conflict itself. Even before the Iran war, U.S. stockpiles of key precision munitions were considered insufficient for a large-scale conflict with a peer adversary such as China, and the latest drawdowns have made that gap considerably more acute. The New York Times, in a recent report, noted that the United States consumed approximately 1,100 long-range stealth cruise missiles during the Iran campaign, missiles that were designed and stockpiled specifically for a potential confrontation with China, representing nearly the entire remaining inventory of those systems. Think about the weight of that for a moment. The weapons America spent years quietly building and storing for the scenario defense planners most feared, a high-end conflict in the Western Pacific, were consumed fighting a country whose annual military budget is a small fraction of China's. China fields thousands of ballistic and cruise missiles, including the DF-21D and DF-26, specifically designed to overwhelm American defenses throughout the Western Pacific, and the strategic concern is intensified because Iran possesses a far smaller and less sophisticated missile force than China, despite causing such extensive American expenditure. Rebuilding will take 3 to 4 years before additional production arrives, given the long wait times for these particular systems, and there are additional constraints including testing capacity, long qualification cycles, and scarcity of critical minerals such as gallium and germanium that China largely controls. And that last detail deserves to be held up to the light and examined very carefully. Because the minerals required to manufacture the guidance systems inside Raytheon's Tomahawks, Patriot interceptors, and THAAD missiles are largely controlled by the country those systems are ultimately supposed to deter. The supply chain for the weapons America depleted fighting Iran runs directly through Beijing. The leverage China holds over American rearmament is not theoretical. It is embedded in the periodic table. Analysts assessing the aftermath of the Iran conflict note that Tehran gained significant experience in emergency rebuilding after the 12-day war of June 2025 and now knows considerably more about which weapons systems are most effective, with one risk intelligence analyst concluding that the campaign most likely failed to inflict a lasting mortal or strategic blow to Iran's missile program. So let's be very direct about what that means. The United States spent tens of billions of dollars, burned through half its most critical defensive interceptor stocks, exposed the structural limitations of 3 flagship Raytheon defense systems under real combat conditions, and the adversary it was fighting is now arguably more experienced, more adaptive, and no less dangerous than before hostilities began. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told reporters there was no shortage of munitions, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dan Kane, said the military had sufficient precision munitions for the task at hand. But both reportedly admitted in a closed congressional briefing that Iran's Shahed drones presented a genuine problem for interceptor systems. There is a word for the distance between what officials say at podiums and what they admit in classified settings, and that word is not reassuring. Because the American public, the people funding this arsenal, the people whose children wear the uniform protecting these bases, deserve to understand that the gap between the official narrative and the operational reality is real, measurable, and consequential. The broader lesson here is one that empires throughout history have been slow to absorb. Technological dominance is not a permanent condition. It erodes, it gets war-tested, it gets exploited by adversaries who do not have to match you system for system but simply need to find the asymmetric pressure points that make your most expensive capabilities irrelevant. Iran found those pressure points. The cheap drone against the multi-million-dollar interceptor. The saturation barrage against the finite magazine. The radar kill that blinds the entire defensive architecture. These are not exotic or novel tactics. They are logical conclusions drawn from decades of studying American military doctrine and looking for the seams. And the 3 Raytheon systems that failed, THAAD's radar vulnerability, the Patriot's finite magazine in a saturation environment, and CRAM's fundamental mismatch against the drone swarm threat, are not failures of engineering so much as they are failures of strategic imagination. The systems were built for a world that no longer exists, marketed to a public that was never told the full picture, and deployed into a conflict that exposed every assumption that was buried in the sales brochure. A January 2026 Heritage Foundation report warned that high-end interceptors such as SM-3, SM-6, Patriot, PAC-3 MSE, and THAAD would likely be exhausted within days of sustained combat with a peer adversary, with some systems depleted after just 2 to 3 major People's Liberation Army salvos, and that aggregate U.S. vertical launch system inventories are insufficient for even one full fleet reload, with peer-side rearming creating multi-week gaps. That is the scenario America is now walking toward, with a depleted arsenal, a multi-year rearmament timeline, and a defense industrial base that was not structured for the speed or scale of this moment. The window of vulnerability is open. It will remain open for years, and the world knows it,